Hey, this is Steve with Dabble Lab, and today I'm joined by Dustin Coates. Dustin is the voice search go-to-market lead at Algolia Software. He is also the co-host on the popular VUX World podcast and the author of the book Voice Applications for Alexa and Google Assistant for Manning Publications. Dustin, you are a busy guy, so for starters, thanks so much for sharing your time with us today. Before we get into it, can you tell us what you'll be showing us how to do and what kind of experience or prerequisites we need to follow along?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. So today what we're going to do, this is a bit of a sneak preview. It is the project that we build in chapter 12 of my book that you mentioned. It hasn't been released yet. So my book is, the way my publisher does things is it releases it in early release. You can follow along almost as I write it. But this hasn't been released yet. So this will be, the people viewing it will be one of the first people to see it. We're going to build an action for the Google Assistant platform using the Actions SDK.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, cool. All right.
So in terms of prerequisites, some familiarity with the command line is useful. Not too much. We'll walk through largely exactly what you have to do, but it does certainly help. If you are on a Mac, you should be able to follow along pretty easily. I'm actually using a Windows today, a Windows computer, but I'm using something called the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is essentially Linux on Windows. So if you are on a Windows PC and you want to follow along the command line commands, the terminal commands, just know that that's what I'm doing. You can certainly do this on Windows specifically if you want. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And the first thing that we would want to do is we want to download the gactions CLI. What this is a command line tool that really provides you some resources on getting up and running and deploying your Google Assistant action. If you've ever used the Ask CLI, it's very similar. The main difference is that while the Ask CLI is distributed by NPM, so you just have to install a package that way, with the gactions CLI, you do actually have to download that specifically for your operating system.
Got it.
The thing to note here, again, is if you are using that Windows subsystem for Linux, you make sure you download the Linux one right there. Otherwise, download on Mac, Windows, or Linux if that's what your platform is.
Got it.
Once you have that installed, you're going to go over to the terminal. And so I'm going to pull that up. I use Hyper. I like it. It's not the fastest in the world, but it certainly gets the job done. We'll go ahead and create a Dabble directory right here. We'll go ahead and create it first, and then we'll head into it. Once we head into there, the interesting thing is that you have to reference that gactions executable from where you are, or you have to put it into your path. I haven't done that yet. I just downloaded on this machine. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and reference that. There we go. And we'll go ahead and say gactions init. This doesn't actually do all that much. We'll see that all it does is it creates this action.json file, which is where we're going to have that the application configuration.
When you run the install, it doesn't add it to your path. It sounds like the
right. Yeah. So you're not actually even running the install. You're literally just downloading the CLI executable itself. So that's a good point. You do, if you haven't already, you do need to make sure that that is executable. That page right there provides you with all the instructions that you need on that.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. We also need to go ahead and create the files for the fulfillment. So the action.json is going to configure the application, but the code that's actually going to handle our request, we need to do that ourselves. What I like to do when I'm on Actions, the Actions platform, the assistant platform, is I go all in on Google. So I'm going to use Firebase functions there. If you don't have it already, you need the Firebase tools. The Firebase tools, that is an NPM package. So you can download that, make sure that you have it installed globally so that you can really reference it from anywhere. And so what we're going to do there is just Firebase init. And that's going to initialize a Firebase project for us. On my machine, it's going to take a little bit of time to get running, but once it does, you'll see right here, we have all these different options for exactly what we want to do. What we will do here is we really don't care about these other sort of features that the Firebase service provides. We really just want the code that will handle the request. So that's going to be the functions feature. So the next thing that we want to do is let's go ahead and create a project inside of the Actions console. And so we'll pull up our browser for that and go to the Actions console and go ahead and click on Add or Import a Project. I'll just go ahead and give mine the name of Dabble, keep the language as English, and I'll create that project right now. This step is important to do now because once we create the fulfillment code, we're going to do it through Firebase functions, and we'll need to connect that with an Actions project.
Okay.
And here we are going to select the Actions SDK as the project type. Right. And so let's go ahead and we can leave that where it is right now and go back to the terminal. As I mentioned, we are going to use Firebase for the fulfillment because when I'm on the assistant platform, I really tend to just go all in with Google and use Firebase functions to host the fulfillment. You can certainly host it on Lambda or really anywhere else. You could host it on your own server if you'd like. I just find that it's easiest to go ahead and stay in that domain and inside the Google ecosystem. What you'll want to do before this step, I've already done it, but make sure that you have the Firebase tools package installed. You're going to install that through NPM, and you want to make sure that that's installed globally so that you can call it from anywhere and you can use it to initialize a project. So once you have that, you'll call Firebase init. And now it'll take a little bit of time to get up and running, at least on my machine. But once that happens, you will see that it provides us with a few different options of Firebase features that we might want to use. We really only care about the code that's going to handle our request. And so we're going to select functions with a spacebar and go ahead and hit enter to move to the next screen. This is where it's going to ask you which project you want to associate with this Firebase project. We'll go ahead and associate the one we just created, the one that I call Dabble. Okay. Here it's going to ask us whether we want JavaScript or TypeScript. Let's go ahead and stick with JavaScript for now. I like using ESLint, so I'm going to use that to make sure that I have an enforced style, my code doesn't get sloppy, and that it hopefully catches some bugs ahead of time. And we'll go ahead and install the NPM packages. So it already created a functions directory for us. It created an ESLint configuration. It has some defaults that the Firebase team prefers, but you can certainly go in and change that. And it also created the index.js, the code that's going to handle our request.
So this is sort of it looks like at this point, kind of analogous to if you're familiar with Alexa development, you've got the project folder and the skill.json file, which is, I guess, the equivalent of the JSON configuration file here, and now you're creating what would be the Lambda custom folder.
Exactly. This is sort of really inherent in the way that the Actions sort of workflow goes with on the Assistant platform. It's a lot more modular than what you have with Alexa.
Got it.
You can bring your own NLU. For example, most actions are going to use Dialogflow, but when you use the Actions SDK, you probably won't use Dialogflow. You might use your own NLU. We'll do a very simple natural language processing in this project using regular expressions.
Okay.
But it doesn't force you into that. And so it's very similar here. Instead of having a tool that really provides you everything, you're expected to configure that yourself. You're expected to set up the project structure yourself. There's some pros and cons to each, certainly, but they are very different approaches. And in terms of what you were mentioning, what the action.json is analogous to, it is very similar to the skill.json, but it's also very similar as well to the interaction schema as well. That action.json is going to contain both the configuration of the overall action, but also how the users are going to interact with it.
Got it. So it's the interaction model, but not necessarily building the NLU model.
It's a little bit that. It's really pushing off most of the NLU to your code, but we'll see that you are going to provide some sample phrases in there that's going to really bias what the assistant is understanding.
Gotcha.
So in fact, this is actually a good opportunity. These dependencies sometimes take a bit to install. So let's go ahead and check out that action.json file. And once I open up that project, we'll take a look at the action.json, and we'll also take a look at what Firebase has provided to us as well. So what we see here is that the action.json doesn't really provide us all that much right now. It lists out the actions, and actions, if you're new to the platform, it can be a little confusing. What are actions? What are intents? What are applications? What's the difference? So the way I think about it is action equals intent plus fulfillment. It's what the user wants to do and what your code is going to do to handle that. And you can see that listed within here, in fact. So this is just, for us, it's just describing what this action is, but it also points to specific fulfillment. The interesting thing about the Actions SDK is you really decouple your actions from your fulfillments a bit, in that you've got these listed down here, and for each action, you need to specify which conversation, which fulfillment is going to take care of that action. So in theory, you could have multiple actions that are handled by different fulfillments. I don't know of any assistant applications that do that in practice, but you can if you wanted to. And then what we have right here is we've got the intent listed out. This is more similar to what we see in the Alexa interaction schema, where you've got a name right here, and anything that's prefaced with actions.intent is going to be a built-in intent.
Okay.
And then you have triggers and query patterns here as well. So you can say talk to Dabble, for example, and you can fill those out. This is what is going to bias the assistant towards matching talk to Dabble and then matching it to this intent right here. With the actions.intent.main, this is triggered as well when someone just launches specifically the application. So, hey Google, talk to Dabble. This is going to launch this intent right here.
Oh, apologies, I don't understand.
Sorry about that. And so it will trigger this right here as well. But you can fill out other intents too. In the application that we're building right now, we are only going to have this actions.intent.main intent, but you'll want more than that. The reason for that is Assistant has this idea of deep linking where a user can ask for something generally,
Okay.
and Assistant will route to the best action that can handle it. This is very similar, again, comparing it to Alexa, this is very similar to the can fulfill intent.
Okay.
In fact, it's a lot easier than can fulfill intent because you don't need to provide anything in your fulfillment code that says, yes, I can fulfill this request.
So you're just providing examples of what users might say? Is that accurate?
Yeah, you're providing examples of what users might say. And then back in the Actions console, you'll go in and you'll specify to Google which of your actions might be worthwhile or might be eligible for
Okay.
someone to ask for without knowing what your application is. To
Gotcha.
give you an example, I built an application for Assistant that is all baseball scores. And so some of my actions might be getting the scores of specific teams or finding out when they play next. And I tell Google, hey, if somebody asks, how did the Astros do last night? Feel free to route them to my action. And through that is where I'm getting a ton of traffic. So the assistant platform is actually really good for that if you want a lot of traffic coming in without having to do it quite as much work as you do on the Alexa side.
So Google's really doing the discovery. So it doesn't sound like it's as important to get the action promoted out there, the discovery of the action. If you can get the phrases that users might say to that align with what you can fulfill.
I think that would be an accurate description. You know, the Alexa has that, or the Alexa platform has that nice, beautiful store that you can see on the Amazon website that really aids in discovery if you can play that well. The Assistant platform has a directory. I don't know how many people know about it. It's not nearly as prevalent, I think, as the Alexa store or marketplace. And Google, at least in my experience, is pushing a lot of that traffic your way. Certainly, if you're a brand, we've spoken with many brands where, you know, it's a big part of them pushing it out there. You know, the Financial Times is someone that my podcast co-host and I spoke with recently, where they actually printed out a paper map to provide to people to push them towards their assistant application. So that's going to play into it as well. But if you're someone who's building something maybe a little bit more general, or you want to get that voice SEO, so to speak, this is a good platform to do it, I think.
Nice.
So,
I'm sorry, I was going to ask one more question. So the links are always going to be links to an assistant action, correct? Like or to the triggers rather are always going to go to a function, or
so this trigger, if someone says talk to Dabble, or if we add it in and we say hey there, right? Then when someone says this, this should trigger this intent. And we'll see that in our code that we need to have handlers to handle the actions.intent.main.
Got it.
The really interesting thing that we'll see once we dig into the code is that this really works on those initial requests. So, hey, talk to Dabble, or hey, talk to Dabble to say hey there. Those kind of things will trigger this or trigger any custom intents that you have. The follow-up intents, though, have their own specific name, and those are not going to be coming through as the intent. You're largely going to be handling that through a specialized built-in text intent that we'll see in just a bit. So let's go ahead and jump into the code. The Firebase functions code that is already provided isn't really very interesting to us. So we'll go ahead and replace that with a little bit of our own. And the first thing that we are going to need, of course, is we are going to need both the Actions SDK and Firebase functions. So we didn't take this step earlier, but you will want to install via npm actions on Google and make sure that you install it inside of the functions directory. Firebase functions won't do that for you.
And again, that came when you did the Firebase init, correct? The functions.
So the functions directory absolutely did. And then you'll need to go inside that functions directory and just do npm install actions on Google.
Got it.
And have that installed. So this actions on Google, this is another interesting thing about the approach that they took. All of this, again, is really modular. So all of the helpers that the actions on Google sort of library has, you're going to need to import them individually. So here we're importing the Actions SDK helper right here. And it's not just import everything, but import this small piece so that the other things that we don't need to be in there. So if you're using something that will pare down the code, will do tree shaking or anything like that, it will very much limit what you need to deploy.
Got it.
Let's go ahead and build the first handler. And this handler is going to be very simple. We'll, in practice, want to make it more feature rich. We want to use this as the welcome intent, where people are going to come in, and we want to tell them what this application does. But we'll just start off really simple so that we understand what's going on. So the first thing we need is to initialize, before we even handle that intent, is we need to initialize the application frame. This is the central place where everything runs through it. If we think again to the Alexa model, where you have that skill builder, the skill builder in the new version of the SDK, this is going to be similar to that. This is going to provide us some helpers that will allow us to handle requests. The main difference here is that we are going to register them sort of at the source, then at that helper level. So let's see exactly what that means. So we're going to call that app. And here we're going to use the Actions SDK library, and we'll pass it in some options. Most of the time, the only options that you really care about too much are debug, and you'll set that for false if you don't want debug information, or you'll set it to true if you want some logging whenever requests come in. From there, that app object has an intent method. That intent method, we need to provide it 2 arguments. The first argument is the name of the intent that we want to handle, and the second argument is a handler itself. So that first intent is the actions.intent.main one. That's the one that we saw right here inside the action.json. That's the one where somebody launches the application directly without any follow-up phrase. This is the one that's going to be triggered.
So that's sort of the launch request again in the Alexa nomenclature.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And then the next thing we'll provide is that handler, the handler function. And so I'll go ahead and write this out, and then I'll explain what's going on. So we'll just say conv.ask, hey there, what do you want to do? What this does is the intent method right here will provide us information about what the input is, what the request is, but it will also provide us this conv helper. The app you can sort of think of as an application-wide helper, and the conv helper is a request-specific helper. So things like conv.ask will provide that response and then keep the mic open. Conv.close will just say the response. So a lot is built onto this conv helper right here.
So the conv is building your response back to the assistant service.
That's right. Yeah, it's building that JSON that's going to be sent back to the assistant service and then sending it off as well.
Got it. And the input is the request.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. In other situations, especially when there are parameters, so we didn't see it right here, but inside this action.json, you can also provide parameters or sort of slots, and those will be sent along as arguments as well. But the first argument is always going to be that conv helper right there.
Got it.
And then the final thing we need to do is we need to provide this out to Firebase function so that once it runs this code, it knows exactly what to look for. So this will be exports.dabble, and we'll call functions.https.onRequest, and we'll pass it this app helper. So essentially what this is doing is it's assembling it in that sort of format that Firebase functions is expecting so that it can then send it out to the Actions platform.
Okay.
So we've got our code right there. Let's go ahead and deploy that out. So the package.json that the Firebase CLI has, Firebase tools has created for us, list out some commands. And so I actually want to show what those commands are. And one of those is Firebase deploy. And what that essentially is Firebase deploy -- only function. So we're deploying only the function code itself. And that's going to be wrong. That should be only functions.
Okay.
And what this is going to do is it's going to send your code off to the Firebase functions, and it's going to provide you with a URL back. And that URL is going to be what you provide to the assistant platform. And it says, hey, this is where the code lives that will handle the request.
Gotcha. So that's the endpoint that the action service is going to call.
That's exactly right. And again, your fulfillment can live wherever you want.
Okay.
While this is deploying, let me show one thing that's something that's very useful to me that I've started using when deploying locally, or rather when running locally. So what you can also do is you can use a service like Ngrok, and that will allow you to essentially put your local code out there at a URL that anyone can access. And so you can provide that to assistants. And while you're deploying or while you're developing, that those requests through the assistant platform will actually come to your code. So instead of having to edit your code and deploy it again, edit your code, deploy it again, you're just having that run locally.
Yeah, so we'll leave a link to that in the show notes also. So ngrok is a great tool for, if you're wanting to, basically it routes a request back to your local machine. So it's kind of an alias URL gateway, I guess, that lets you run a local HTTP server that is accessible publicly.
Exactly. And so we saw earlier that you can log out the incoming request to that debug true setting right there. But what I like to do as well is sometimes that's just a little too much. It's going to the terminal. Plus, additionally, I like to have that request so that I can use it for testing or so that I can dig through it. And so I like to add just a little bit of code that will essentially write that incoming request to a request file right here. And so what that does is it takes in the request and it checks to see if it has this local attribute. This local attribute is something that I add during just a small test script that I have so that it doesn't overwrite this every single time. And then the Actions SDK has something really, really interesting. And you can actually add middleware onto it. So you can intercept a request and you can add that right in to that initialization of the Actions SDK. And now every request that comes through is going to run through here first.
It's kind of like Express. If you've ever played with the Express framework in Node, the middleware.
Yeah, exactly. It's incredibly powerful. You can use this as well to, I believe, add information onto that conv object as well. So it's not just useful for logging or things like that, but you can also use it, for example, if you want to do localization, I believe you would want to do that in the middleware also.
Got it. So so I understand this on the capturing the request and saving it to a JSON file. You're doing that so that you can then use that JSON file to run local tests using the same request format. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And I can even illustrate it maybe a little bit better by showing you what my test script looks like. It's quite simple. And so the important thing to remember when you're starting with a platform, any platform, whether it's on Alexa or whether it's here, is that at the end of the day, you're just running code. You're just calling functions. And I think this illustrates it pretty well. So I would put this in a test directory and just have that request.json alongside of it. This is where I set that local attribute right there, so I'm not overriding my request. And then I run the code. And that way, instead of having to go out to the assistant platform, I can run it right here. This certainly doesn't take the place of end-to-end unit tests. But if I just want to test something out really quickly, I'm just calling a function, and so I'm going to send it over.
Yeah, and this is I do the exact same general approach when I'm doing local development on Alexa skills, and Twilio Autopilot has functions, or Twilio has functions also that I've been using recently, and use the exact same approach. I'll leave a link out. I did a while back a tutorial on local testing that kind of uses this approach.
So going back to the terminal, it is now finished deploying. And so that will give us our URL. It will give us the URL at which the function is hosted. It will be right here. It will say function URL, parentheses Dabble, and we can go ahead and copy that. And we are going to take that and put that in the action.json. And what we need to do right here is we need to provide the name. Notice this is exactly the same here, here, and here. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that all at once. I'll say Dabble. We could call that Dabble Fulfillment, Dabble whatever. And this is going to be the URL that we have right there. Okay. We need to then send that off to the Google Assistant platform. And so we'll again use that Actions CLI, and we can use that to send it to the Google Assistant platform using the Actions CLI right there, using Actions updates. So inside of that Dabble directory, we'll again just call Actions. And then we want to push it for testing. And so we'll do Actions test. Then we need to specify where the action package lives. And that's going to be at action.json. And then we need the project, -- project with the project ID, which is related to what we specified in the console. So we will use the Actions CLI to go ahead and push that up there. And so we need to reference the right one if it's not in your path. So it'll be Actions, and then we need to publish it for testing. So do test. It needs to know where our action package is. And that's going to be --action_package and the location right there. And we need to specify what the project is. And for this one, it's going to be Dabble. And so it is pushing that up right now. And it needs access to my Google account. You may see this as well. And you will just be able to open that up. It should give you an authorization code. So we need to next deploy this up to the Assistant platform.
Okay.
If you remember earlier on, we created that project and I said, just leave it for now. We're going to go into the code. Now we're going to go back to that project.
All right.
Inside your browser, if you left that window open, you will have the directions on how to get started because we specified Actions SDK. And it tells exactly how to go ahead and update that. It's Actions update, the action package, and then our project. So mine is Dabble and then some numbers. Go ahead and copy that and take that back to the terminal and deploy that. So you want to make sure that you're getting the right project name. It's not just the name that you specified because it needs to be unique to you. Okay. And where it says package name right here, we will point it in the right direction. Oh, and again, if you haven't added it to your path, you need to make sure that it's pointing in the right place. So now that we're back in the code and we're back at the terminal, one thing that we need to make sure that we actually add is we need to specify the fulfillment API version. It needs to be API version 2. This is something that Google moved over, I believe, around spring of last year, spring of 2008. And so let's go ahead and make sure that happens, and then go ahead, Actions updates, specify where the action package is. It's at action.json, and your project ID, not mine, but the one that you got from the browser. Once you do that, you will have that successfully updated with the actions. It will be inside the console, and you'll have this URL where you can go ahead and configure that there as well with things like the icon, with other information about the application itself.
That would be like the publishing information.
Right, exactly. We need to do one more thing though. There's also gactions to send it for testing too. So let's go ahead and do that. So you're going to want to go ahead and do just the same command, but instead of update, you'll do test right here. And then we can test that inside the console and test it on the device as well. So here it's giving you a URL for the simulator directly. So we've seen how to configure the action. We've seen how to start off the fulfillment. We've seen how to test it locally and pull in the request. And we discussed how to run that locally too. What I added really quickly right here is a handler for the actions.intent.text intent. This is another one of those built-in intents, and this is going to be essentially a follow-up intent to this one. So essentially when somebody says, hey there, what do you want to do? And the user responds to that, it's going to respond to actions.intent.text. The interesting thing about this platform, just like using the assistant with Dialogflow, is you're getting the full request right here. And that means you're getting that full text. And you're able to do whatever you want with it. You can send it to another NLU platform if you want. You can match it on regular expressions. So we might build a regular expression called invocation matcher to match on certain functionalities right there. That's what we do in the chapter in my book. We actually build an assistant inside the assistant using regular expressions. And then you can handle that however you want. So that's where this becomes really powerful, is you're not limited just to slot values and intents. You actually get that full text and you can do whatever you want with it.
Got it. So in this case here, you're really just getting the voice to text part of it, right? Or I guess if you did it from a mobile device, it's the raw text that somebody sent in, and then you can handle that however you like. That's nice.
Yeah, it's super cool. It's really useful, especially if you want to reason about how these assistants are working under the covers. Go in there, build a bot, build an application where you're getting that full text, and then you need to handle it yourself. And you're going to quickly discover, oh, like these are the considerations that might be taken into account when they're doing that. And then finally, to wrap everything up, we did that gactions test command, which provided us your URL to the simulator. Now you can test it on your Google Home, your Google Home Mini, your Home Hub, or you can come into the simulator and test it there as well. And so you see that I said, talk to my test app. Until you configure it with a name, it's always called my test app. And you see that it has the response that we crafted as well. The simulator is extremely, extremely powerful. You can specify what type of device you're on, a phone, a speaker, or something with a smart display, the language, the location, and you can see the request, the response, and do a lot of debugging here as well.
That's nice.
Okay. And so altogether, that's the beginning, at least, of building an application using the Actions SDK.
This is great. And where how deep do you go from here in your book? Does it go significantly deeper, I'm guessing?
Yeah, so there's an entire chapter on building with the Actions SDK, and we build, like I mentioned, an assistant inside the assistant. So by the end of the chapter, what you're building is this assistant that you can speak with. You can add numbers together. It will repeat text back to you. It's not the most powerful assistant, but you're building it yourself, including processing the text that's coming in. And then we also build actions on Dialogflow as well. So you can get a comparison, actions with the Actions SDK, actions with Dialogflow, and compare that to the Alexa platform too.
Got it. Yeah, I got a question from somebody recently that I think would make for an interesting project, but somebody asked, how would I test like one NLU over another? Like if I wanted to try like, a test case across like Microsoft's Lewis, Amazon Lex, maybe even Raza or, something open source, like what's a good way to do it? It sounds like the assistant platform might make that pretty easy, right? Like you could just set it up so that everybody gets the same voice recognition piece, and then you could try the different NLUs to see which one is, the preferred one in different scenarios, maybe.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to do it, and you could have that Google device in front of the testers and cover after the fact the data and go, okay, well this one was really good, this one didn't work out so well.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Hey, Dustin, thanks again for sharing this with us. This was really great. But before we close out, how do we find your book, first of all, and how can we connect with you if we want to connect with you on Twitter or your preferred online hangout?
Yeah, for sure. So the book, you can go to talking2.co/book or go to manning.com and you can find the book there. It's an early release right now and will be out in paperback hopefully the spring of 2019. And then you can find me at talking2.computers.com or on Twitter with @dcoates.
Okay, awesome. Well, hey, thanks again, and we'll call it a wrap for this one. But I'll leave all of those links in the notes, and we will we'll catch you on Twitter and at the Manning site.
Thanks so much, Steve.